So with that, I'd like to ask my friend Scott Harris to come up, and we're going to proceed to the next part of the program. We'll get him a proper nameplate there.
I'm happy to sit behind Congressman. It's all right.
Okay. Well, I'm really grateful that Scott's here. Scott is really an old dear friend. I don't mean old in the sense of age, but I mean old in the sense of a long-time friend. So officially, his present title is Senior Spectrum Advisor at NTIA, and of course he represents the agencies and work to expand the use of spectrum, and that's a subject that's on all of our minds now because of its importance, and I'm not going to steal any of his thunder talking about that. You'll see from his bio in the brochure that Scott has served at top-level positions in a number of different agencies. And I'll just say this, it wouldn't surprise me that at some point Scott is the head of one of these agencies. I think he's awfully talented. And I say that really knowing, we've talked about diversity of opinions before, and I think Scott knows this. I'm sure I'm not always going to agree with everything that Scott says, but I know one thing, I really respect his commitment to public service and the way you've devoted a good part of your career to public service. So I'll just stop with this before Scott takes the podium. I first met him when he was the first chief of the FCC's International Bureau, shortly after it was created. And I had some dealings with Scott then. At that time, I was representing what we called the 3 television networks. That's what they were, and they had some international matters, and I had some dealings with Scott. And the thing that I remember, without having to go into any of the details, which I'm not sure I would remember anyway, was just how Scott was so refreshing because he was willing to look at things in a different way and cut through some of the red tape. I mean, to get an Earth station license, it was like building the Brooklyn Bridge or something. And Scott, I came away from that experience saying, this is someone that really wants to get something done and knew how to do it and was willing to do it, and that's always remained with me. So I'm pleased you're here with us to tell us what you're doing over at NTIA, Scott.
So thank you for that nice introduction, though I have to say first, before I do anything, happy anniversary to Randy and Lori. How you've managed to make it to 52 years by bringing her to events like this on your anniversary. Man, you're a better man than I. So, look, I am really honored to be among such a distinguished group of speakers today. And one of my friends looked at the program and saw my picture and said, which picture doesn't belong here? Which was exactly my view. When Randy first invited me, he said, look, I'd like you to make some news. Now, sadly, in light of all of NTIA's recent announcements, I have no news left. So I thought instead I'd talk about our national spectrum strategy and our request for comments that we used to kick that off. But maybe you could all pretend you haven't heard it before, and that would be almost as good. In any case, I used LinkedIn, among other things, to announce our request for comments. Commissioner Carr, who, as you probably know, is a social media giant, immediately responded, "More spectrum, that's my comment." He's good, right? So I am most definitely not a social media giant. The only likes I get is when I put pictures up of my granddaughter, which I actually do too often. But I responded to Commissioner Carr. I said, yes, more spectrum. That's the whole point. So I'd like to begin by noting several outcomes of the National Spectrum Strategy even before it's written, because several outcomes are actually not in doubt. The first, there will be access to sufficient licensed spectrum for advanced wireless networks and services, including for the continued rollout of 5G and for the development of 6G. Two, there will be access to sufficient spectrum for advanced wireless networks and services that are unlicensed, licensed by rule, or some combination thereof. We recognize that private sector spectrum access is critical to ensure that the U.S. continues to be the global leader in technology innovation, and that the U.S. economy continues to be the most robust in the world. We will not relinquish global leadership in advanced wireless networks to any other country, and particularly not to countries that do not share our values. We believe such leadership is a matter of national security as well as a matter of economic security. At the same time, access to sufficient spectrum for federal missions is also critical to our national security, our public safety, and our economic security. Whether it's flying a drone over the Black Sea and sending back video when it's attacked, or providing situational awareness and force protection in the South China Sea, or enabling moon landing missions, federal agencies need sufficient spectrum access as well. And spectrum-reliant federal missions are growing, not shrinking. So the third outcome of our spectrum strategy is going to be sufficient spectrum for both current and future federal missions. Now, a fair question might be, though, can you do everything everywhere all at once? The answer has to be yes. And I phrase that very carefully. The answer has to be yes. There is literally no choice. We are not going to cede global technology leadership to anyone. And we are not going to compromise our national security anywhere. So that's the thinking behind the national spectrum strategy we are developing, and we are going to come out in those three places. Now, I'm going to turn to the RFC for just a second, if you don't mind. It contains three sections. The first section seeks input on which spectrum bands require in-depth study for more intensive use by both the private sector and by federal agencies. Our goal is to identify at least 1,500 megahertz of spectrum for such study. The second section focuses on spectrum planning process. How can we better ensure open, productive, and importantly, consistent discussions among federal agencies and between the private sector and the government? And the third section focuses on how technology, current or future, can be used to permit more intensive spectrum use. Based on the input we receive from the public, based on our own thinking, and based on our collaboration with our colleagues at the FCC and the executive branch agencies, we plan to release the spectrum strategy later this year. And as noted, we hope to identify 1,500 megahertz of spectrum for intensive study. Those studies will be completed in their entirety in 2 years. For those who've read the RFC, anybody, just out of curiosity? Oh, good, all right, and Larry, I knew you would have. I thought I might provide a little bit of the thinking behind how those documents were written. Those of you who read it will know we did not identify particular bands for discussion, and we did not suggest the proper licensing framework, either for specific bands or even for specific situations. And that's not because we don't have thoughts on the subject. We actually do. But we made instead a conscious decision that we did not wish to channel the discussion based on our preconceived notions. Instead, we hope to encourage a full public discussion that was not centered on our thinking. And my approach to this was actually informed by my experience at the FCC that Randy alluded to almost 30 years ago, though he didn't say it was 30 years ago. When the International Bureau was formed, I was its first chief. And the first thing we did was put out a public notice, basically asking stakeholders an open-ended question. How can our regulatory scheme be improved? I don't know if it's been done since, but I know it had never been done before. And we thought we knew what people would come in and say. Turns out we were wrong. Turns out what we thought was the merest tip of the iceberg of what people needed to tell us. The input we received in that process gave us a list of ideas, an agenda that took us 2 years to work through. I've never forgotten that experience. So here, we also wanted to avoid asking the private sector to respond to our thinking. Rather, I wanted us to respond to the private sector's thinking. You know, maybe it'll make no difference in the end, who knows? I thought it was worth trying, and that's why we wrote the RFC as we did. We also spent some time talking about federal missions, as well as all the reasons the private sector needs additional spectrum access. And so we asked questions also about the spectrum that federal missions need today and will need tomorrow. Our thinking was that a spectrum strategy that did not take into account the needs of federal missions didn't deserve to be called a strategy. It could only be called a wish list. And our nation deserves an actual strategy. A couple of last random thoughts to share. First, as I said, we'll be studying bands, doing in-depth study of bands and completing those studies within 2 years. To be clear, that's not going to slow down the existing work. It's not like, okay, everything is now going to take 2 years, right? We're going to keep doing what we're doing at the same pace, maybe even speeding it up a bit. So our 2-year timeline to finish all of our studies isn't going to slow down any ongoing work. Second, we ask questions about short, medium, and long-term spectrum needs. By asking questions about where we need to be in 10 years, I want it to be clear we're not giving short shrift to where we need to be in 2 years and 5 years. Finally, we ask questions about technology solutions that might enable more intensive spectrum use. To be clear, as the former general counsel of the Department of Energy, I don't really understand why the light goes on when you flick up a switch. But I am nevertheless a believer in technological innovation. And I cannot help but believe that there will be innovation, real innovation, in this space that will lead to the permission of additional spectrum sharing and more intensive spectrum use. Having said that, we are not waiting for a deus ex machina to resolve our spectrum issues. We'll use the tools we have today while hoping for and maybe even helping develop better tools in the future. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Thank you for inviting me here today, and if you all have time, I'd be happy to take a few questions if anyone has them.
That would be great. Thank you, Scott, and thanks for those remarks. I think we ought to give Scott a round of applause while we're thinking of questions.
Thank you. I thought I stunned everyone into silence.
Okay, do we have any questions? And if you do, we have a mic we're gonna bring around here as well. I see one in the back, Kathy, and would you identify yourself and go ahead, just identify yourself and keep it in the form of a question.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst. I'm wondering, since spectrum is a zero-sum game, where are we stealing? Who are we stealing from to reallocate all this stuff?
So I cut a line from my speech, and I'm sorry I did now. I don't believe spectrum is a zero-sum game. there's new technology, there are all sorts of trade-offs. It's not a zero-sum game, any more than computational power is a zero-sum game, in my view. Now, if I'm wrong about that, you're right, but I'm confident I'm not wrong about that. And I've yet to talk to an engineer, the folks who really do this stuff, right? I'm a lawyer at the end of the day. I'm a process guy. Right? The engineers, none of them think it's a zero-sum game. At least I've yet to run into one who has. And if there's an engineer who says it's a zero-sum game, and you don't raise your hand right now, because I'll be embarrassed.
Okay, do we have another question? I see Lynn again. Lynn.
Hey, Lynn.
Hi, Scott. Lynn Stanton from TR Daily, and this is actually a question from my colleague Paul Kirby, so I hope you understand
I don't answer questions from Paul. I'm sure he's told you that.
He says, how can NTIA put out a strategy this year if you don't have the results of all the studies, and won't the strategy have specific megahertz goals?
So the whole point of it's a fair question. The point of the strategy is to identify the bands to study, not to finish the studies. It just takes too long. The point is we will identify the bands for intensive study based on what the public has to say, what our friends in the federal agencies have to say, what our friends at the FCC have to say, and then we will spend up to 2 years doing the intensive study for those bands. One of the things I actually didn't know before I came to NTIA, despite having done this for a very long time, is how much work is required to do a study to see what can be done with an existing band. So you need not to know there are just radars in the band, right? You need to know the precise location of every one. You need to know exactly where it's pointed. You need to know how many times of the day it is turned on, and when during the day, and what power, and how, and you need to know for everyone in the entire country. And the studies are very intense. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of effort. That's why it can be a 2-year process.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if we have one. Okay, I think if not, let's give Scott another round of applause, please.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.